The silence of the suburbs was supposed to be a balm. That's what I told myself when I signed the papers, when I watched the city skyline shrink in my rearview mirror until it was just a jagged gray line against a smog-colored haze. I was trading the chaotic symphony of sirens and strangers for the gentle hum of lawnmowers and the rustle of leaves. I was buying peace. What I got was a different kind of noise, a louder one, because it was all inside my own head. My life had become a study in isolation, conducted in a beige two-bedroom house with beige walls and a yard that was slowly surrendering to weeds. For the first month, I existed in a state of suspended animation. I unpacked boxes with the enthusiasm of a pallbearer, arranging my life into neat, sterile stacks that did nothing to fill the echoing emptiness of the rooms. I worked from home, a ghost in my own machine, my only interactions a series of polite emails and disembodied voices on conference calls. The loneliness wasn't new, but its texture had changed. In the city, it had been a sharp, frantic thing, a constant awareness of being alone in a crowd of millions. Here, it was a slow, creeping fog, thick and suffocating. It settled in the corners of the house and in the hollows of my chest. And then I saw him. It was a Tuesday. The air was thick with the promise of summer heat, and the drone of a cicada was the only sound breaking the morning stillness. I was at my kitchen sink, nursing a lukewarm coffee and staring blankly at the overgrown privet hedge that marked the border of my property, when a new sound cut through the quiet. A low, rhythmic rasping. Sawing. I leaned closer to the window, peering through a gap in the neglected leaves. He was in the yard next door. That was my first impression, not a man, but a collection of movements. The steady pull and push of a handsaw against a low-hanging branch of an old oak tree. The flex of muscle in his back and shoulders under a plain gray t-shirt. The sawdust clinging to his dark hair and the sun catching the sweat on his neck. He moved with a kind of unhurried competence that I found mesmerizing. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Just a man and a task, a simple, clean equation. I watched him for a long time, long enough for my coffee to go cold. He finished the branch, lowered it carefully to the ground, and then straightened up, wiping his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. He turned, and for the first time, I saw his face. It was strong-jawed, weathered by the sun, with a seriousness in his brow that was immediately contradicted by the slight upward tilt at the corner of his mouth when he looked at his work. He wasn't smiling, not really, but there was a quiet satisfaction there. He looked solid, grounded, everything I was not. That was the inciting incident. Not a dramatic explosion or a fateful meeting, but the simple act of a man sawing a branch in his yard. It was the moment my quiet, internal world was breached by an external presence I couldn't ignore. He became a feature of my landscape, as fixed and compelling as the sunrise. My neighbor. I didn't even know his name. A week later, the catalyst I didn't know I was waiting for arrived in the form of a summer thunderstorm. It rolled in fast and violent, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. The wind tore through the neighborhood, and I watched from my living room window as a heavy limb from the ancient maple in my own backyard cracked with a sound like a gunshot and crashed down onto the fence that separated our properties. It took out a 10-foot section, leaving a splintered, gaping hole. The next morning, I stood staring at the damage, a fresh wave of inadequacy washing over me. This was a problem that required tools I didn't own and skills I didn't possess. It was another testament to my general inability to manage the physical world. I was contemplating the humiliating process of finding a handyman in the phone book when I heard his voice. "Looks like you took a hit," I turned. He was standing on his side of the wreckage, hands on his hips. He'd traded the t-shirt for a faded flannel, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, corded forearms dusted with dark hair. His gaze was steady, moving from the broken fence to my face. It wasn't a pitying look, just an assessment. "Yeah," I managed, my voice sounding rusty. "Big tree, that it is," he agreed, his eyes traveling up the trunk of the maple. "I'm Mason, by the way." He extended a hand through the gap in the fence. It was large, calloused, with clean, short nails. I took it. My own hand felt small and soft in his grip. The handshake was firm, brief, and sent a ridiculous jolt straight up my arm. "Leo," I said. "Leo," he repeated, the name sounding different in his low, gravelly voice. It sounded more substantial. He let his hand drop. "I've got a chainsaw." I can help you buck this up. We can probably salvage some of the fence posts, too. It was a simple offer of help, a neighborly gesture. But to me, in my self-imposed exile, it felt like a lifeline thrown across a chasm. It was an intrusion, a welcome one, into the sterile quiet I had curated. I looked at the splintered wood and the tangled branches, then back at him, at the calm capability in his eyes. I wouldn't even know where to start, I admitted, the confession feeling more significant than it should have. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Everyone's got to start somewhere. How about I come over after I finish my coffee? And just like that, he was in my yard. My life. The observation phase had begun, only now, it was no longer from the safe distance of my kitchen window. It was close enough to smell the sawdust and the faint, clean scent of his soap. Close enough to feel the ground vibrate when he started the chainsaw. For the next few weeks, Mason became the focal point of my days. My work, which had once been a welcome distraction, was now a tedious obligation that kept me from my real occupation, watching him. From my office window, which overlooked his backyard, I had a perfect vantage point. I learned the rhythm of his life. He was up with the sun, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand as he surveyed his garden. He worked from a large workshop in his garage, the sound of saws and sanders a constant, comforting hum throughout the day. He was a carpenter, I gathered, or a furniture maker. Trucks would occasionally pull up, and he and another man would load or unload heavy, blanket-wrapped shapes. I watched the way he moved. There was an economy to it, a grace that seemed at odds with his solid build. When he lifted a heavy slab of wood, he did it with a fluid strength that was beautiful to watch. When he was sanding a piece, his hands moved over the surface with a tenderness that seemed almost reverent. He was a man deeply at home in his own skin, comfortable with the physical world in a way I could only dream of. My internal analysis of him was relentless, an obsessive cataloging of meaningless details. I noted the way he'd squint against the sun, the small lines crinkling at the corners of his eyes. I noticed he had a habit of biting his lower lip when he was concentrating, a gesture that felt startlingly intimate to witness from afar. I learned that he listened to old soul music in his workshop, the faint, tinny sound of Sam Cooke or Otis Redding drifting across the lawn on a warm afternoon. Every brief interaction we had was dissected for hours afterward. Away from across the yard, a short conversation about the weather over the still-mangled fence. Once, he'd been grilling and called over. Making too much, you want a burger? I'd been so flustered I mumbled something about just having eaten, a lie that I regretted for the rest of the day as the savory smell of charcoal and beef tormented me. Why did he ask? Was it just neighborly politeness? Or was it something more? Did he sense the suffocating loneliness radiating from my house? Did he pity me? My mind would spin these questions into elaborate webs of speculation, trapping me in a cycle of hope and anxiety. I was a scientist studying a new and fascinating species, but the subject was also the source of a constant, low-grade ache in my chest. A yearning so profound it felt like a physical hunger. Then came the touch. It was always small, always plausibly deniable, but each instance was a seismic event in my quiet world. The first time was when we were clearing the last of the fallen tree from my yard. We were lifting a heavy section of the trunk together to move it to a pile by the curb. My grip slipped, and for a second, the weight shifted precariously. His hand shot out and clamped around my forearm to steady me. "Got it?" he asked, his voice calm. His fingers were strong, his palm a brand of heat against my skin. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds, but my brain recorded it in slow motion. The rough texture of his calluses, the pressure of his grip, the way the fine hairs on my arm stood on end. I could feel the pulse in my own wrist hammering against his palm. "Yeah," I breathed out. "Thanks," he let go, and the absence of his touch was more startling than its presence. For the rest of the day, I could feel the phantom sensation of his hand on my arm. My internal monologue went into overdrive. It was just a reaction. He was keeping me from dropping a log on my foot. It meant nothing. But my body didn't believe the logical explanation. My body remembered the warmth, the strength, the connection. A week later, he was helping me fix a loose shingle on my roof that the storm had dislodged. He was up on the ladder, and I was at the bottom, tasked with the simple job of holding it steady. It was a ridiculous reversal of our perceived roles. I, the unsteady one, was meant to be his anchor. He came down the ladder, and as his foot hit the second-to-last rung, he misjudged the distance. He stumbled, just slightly, and his hand landed squarely on my shoulder to brace himself. "Whoa there," he said, with a low chuckle. His hand was heavy on my shoulder. Through the thin fabric of my t-shirt, I could feel the heat of his palm, the distinct pressure of each finger. He didn't move it right away. He just stood there for a moment, his face close to mine, his breath stirring the hair at my temple. It smelled of coffee and something else, something clean and uniquely him, like fresh-cut wood and sunshine. "You're sturdier than you look, Leo," he said, his voice quiet. My heart hammered against my ribs. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the pulse beating in his throat. He gave my shoulder a light squeeze before letting go and stepping back. He turned to gather his tools as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just sent my entire nervous system into a state of high alert. I retreated into my house, my shoulder tingling, my mind a chaotic mess. "Sturdier than you look." Was that a compliment? An observation? Or was I reading far too much into the casual words of a helpful neighbor? I replayed the moment 100 times. The stumble, the weight of his hand, the look in his eyes, which I couldn't decipher. Was it amusement? Or something else I was too afraid to name? The touches became a form of punctuation in our interactions. A hand brushing mine as he passed me a tool, his knee bumping against mine as we sat on his porch steps for a moment, drinking the beers he'd offered me after a long afternoon of yard work. Each contact was fleeting, accidental, and utterly devastating. They were building a bridge between us, a bridge I was terrified to cross, yet desperately wanted to. I was living in a state of constant, low-level arousal, my senses heightened to his presence. I could pick out the sound of his truck turning onto our street. I could smell the scent of the wood smoke from his workshop chimney from 100 feet away. He was seeping into the foundations of my life, and I was doing nothing to stop it. The breakthrough I hadn't dared to hope for came, as these things often do, in the form of a minor disaster. It was a Friday night in late July, the kind of sweltering, humid night where the air itself feels heavy. I was trying to read, but the heat made me restless. Around 10 o'clock, the lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the house into a profound darkness. The air conditioner sputtered into silence. The entire neighborhood went black. A power outage. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a harsh glare in the sudden dark. The utility company's website promised a restoration of power in 3 to 4 hours. I sighed, the silence of the house pressing in on me. It was already hot, and it was only going to get hotter. I opened a window, but the air outside was just as still and oppressive. A few minutes later, a knock came at my front door. It was so unexpected that I flinched. No one ever knocked on my door. I navigated the dark hallway by memory and peered through the peephole. I could just make out a silhouette against the moonlit street. I opened the door. It was Mason. He was holding 2 beers in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The beam was pointed at his feet, casting his face in dramatic shadow. "Power's out," he said, stating the obvious. I noticed. I replied, my attempt at a dry tone failing. "I've got a generator," he said. "But it's noisy. Figured I'd sit on the porch for a while instead. Got an extra beer, if you want to wait it out with me." The invitation hung in the thick, dark air between us. It was a simple, neighborly thing to do. But coming from him, to me, it felt like a monumental gesture. It was an explicit request for my company, not just a casual offer made in passing. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, okay." I followed him across his lawn to his front porch. It was a wide, welcoming space with 2 comfortable-looking wicker chairs and a small table between them. He handed me a beer. The bottle was cold and slick with condensation, a welcome relief against my clammy hand. We sat in the darkness, the only light coming from the moon and the distant flicker of stars. The silence felt different out here. It wasn't the empty, sterile silence of my house, but a living, breathing quiet, filled with the sound of crickets and the rustle of unseen things in the bushes. For a while, we didn't speak. We just drank our beers and listened to the sounds of the night. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, companionable. It felt, strangely, like a conversation in itself. "It's quiet," I said eventually, stating the obvious again. He took a slow drink from his bottle. "I like it quiet. Moved out here from the city about 5 years ago. Never looked back. Me too," I said, surprised. "Just a few months ago for me." "Yeah, I figured," he said. You've still got that city pace. Like you're waiting for a siren to go off. His observation was so accurate it startled me. I did feel perpetually on edge, braced for some unknown alarm. I thought I was hiding it, but he had seen it. He saw me. Is it that obvious? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He turned his head, and in the dim light, I could just make out his profile. Only if you're looking. My breath caught in my throat. The subtext of that statement was a physical weight in the air. He was looking. He had been looking, just as I had been watching him. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. We fell back into silence, but this time it was charged with a new energy. I was acutely aware of him sitting just a few feet away. I could hear the soft sound of his breathing, the clink of his bottle as he set it on the table. I felt stripped bare, as if he had peeled back a layer of my carefully constructed defenses with a single sentence. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. It was a raw, vulnerable question, a direct projection of my own state of being onto him. He didn't answer right away. He stared out into the darkness, his brow furrowed in thought. I immediately regretted asking. It was too much, too personal. "Sometimes," he finally said, his voice low and thoughtful. "But there's a difference between being lonely and being alone. I like being alone. Loneliness is a different animal." He turned to look at me again, his gaze intense even in the shadows. "You get it, don't you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He saw it in me. The loneliness I had been trying to outrun, the isolation that clung to me like a second skin. In that moment, sitting on his dark porch, I felt a sense of connection so profound it almost hurt. He wasn't just my neighbor, the capable man who worked with his hands. He was someone who understood the shape of my own quiet desperation. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick. "I get it." He just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. And in that simple gesture, a wall inside me that I hadn't even known was there began to crumble. He didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He offered something far more valuable: recognition. He saw the real me, the one hiding behind the beige walls and the polite emails, and he wasn't looking away. The lights in the house across the street flickered on, followed by another and another, a wave of electricity washing over the neighborhood. The power was back. The spell was broken. "Well," he said, his voice returning to its normal, easy cadence. "Guess that's our cue." We stood up. The moment of vulnerability had passed, but something had shifted between us, something irreversible. The air was still thick with unspoken things. "Thanks for the beer," I said, my voice sounding inadequate. "And the company, anytime, Leo," he said. He walked me to the edge of his lawn. As I turned to go, he said my name again, stopping me. "Leo." I turned back. "That tree in your backyard," he said, gesturing toward the old maple. "The one that dropped the limb. You should have someone look at it. The whole thing might be rotten." It was a practical, neighborly piece of advice. But the way he said it, the concern in his voice, felt like more. It felt like he was telling me to take care of myself. "I will," I promised. I walked back to my house, the familiar chill of the air conditioning a shock after the humid night air. But for the first time since I'd moved in, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting for me. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that nothing would be the same. The silence was no longer just a void. It was in space filled with the potential of him. The weeks that followed were a strange dance of escalating tension and feigned nonchalance. The foundation of our relationship had shifted that night on the porch. We were no longer just neighbors who made small talk over a broken fence. We were two people who had acknowledged a shared loneliness, a silent understanding that hummed in the space between us. Our interactions became more frequent. He'd find reasons to come over, to borrow a tool he almost certainly owned, to point out a patch of poison ivy near my garage, to drop off a few ripe tomatoes from his garden. Each visit was a carefully calibrated dose of proximity that left me reeling. We talked about books, music, the city we had both left behind. We discovered a shared love for old jazz and a mutual disdain for cilantro. They were small, insignificant details, but they felt like revelations, each one a thread weaving us closer together. The tipping point, the event that made the simmering tension impossible to ignore any longer, was a neighborhood barbecue. It was an annual affair hosted by a boisterous couple down the street. I had received a flyer in my mailbox and had every intention of ignoring it, but Mason caught me on my way to get the mail. You going to the block party tomorrow? He asked, leaning against his truck. Probably not, I said. Not really my scene, come on, he coaxed, a playful glint in his eye. You have to meet the neighbors sometime. Besides, I'll be there. You won't have to suffer alone. You won't have to suffer alone. The words were a perfect encapsulation of my social anxiety, and his offer to be my buffer was too tempting to refuse. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. The party was exactly as I had feared, a chaotic swirl of loud music, screaming children, and overly friendly strangers who asked probing questions about my job and my story. I felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe, a feeling I was all too familiar with. I stood awkwardly by the drink table, nursing a plastic cup of beer and trying to look like I belonged. And then Mason appeared at my side, a calm port in a storm of suburban cheer. He didn't say much, just handed me a plate with a perfectly grilled hot dog on it. Thought you might be hungry, he said. For the rest of the afternoon, he stayed with me. He introduced me to people, effortlessly navigating the small talk and gently deflecting the more intrusive questions. He acted as a shield, a social interpreter. With him there, the noise faded into the background. He created a small bubble of quiet around the two of us. At one point, we were sitting in a pair of lawn chairs, slightly apart from the main crowd, and a woman named Carol, the neighborhood's self-appointed matriarch, came over. It's so nice to see you out, Leo, she said, her voice a little too loud. We were all wondering about the handsome, mysterious man who moved into the old Miller house. She winked at me, then turned her attention to Mason. And Mason, it's about time you brought a friend around. We were starting to think you were a hermit. I felt a hot blush creep up my neck. Mason just smiled, a slow, easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Leo's a good neighbor, he said, his voice neutral. But his knee was pressed against mine, a small, solid point of contact that grounded me. Carol chattered on for a few more minutes before being distracted by a fresh tray of brownies. Sorry about that, Mason said quietly after she left. She means well, it's fine, I said, but my heart was still pounding. The casual intimacy of his presence, the way people were seeing us as a pair, was both thrilling and terrifying. We were performing a role without having read the script. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, the heat of the day finally broke. The air was still warm, but a light breeze stirred the leaves. Many of the families with young children had already left, and a more relaxed, adult atmosphere had settled over the remaining guests. Someone had put on a slow, bluesy song. Mason stood up and stretched. It's getting hot, he said, his eyes finding mine. My pool's probably feeling pretty good right now. It wasn't a question, but it felt like one. It was an invitation, loaded with unspoken possibilities. The image flashed in my mind. His pool, the water dark and cool under the night sky. Just the two of us. This is it. The thought was a jolt of pure adrenaline. This is the moment where you either step forward or you retreat back into your beige house forever. My mouth is dry. I just nod. We said our goodbyes, a series of polite murmurs and waves, and walked back down the street. The streetlights cast halos of pale yellow light on the pavement. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't comfortable or companionable. It was electric. Every step was deliberate. Every breath felt loud in the quiet night. His house was dark. He led me through the side gate into his backyard. It was a private oasis, surrounded by a high wooden fence and carefully tended plants. The pool was a dark turquoise jewel in the center of the yard, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The only light came from a few small, solar-powered lamps tucked into the garden beds. I don't have a spare suit, he said, his voice low. Neither do I replied, my voice sounding tight. He gave me a look, a long, searching look that I couldn't decipher in the dim light. Then he turned away and began to unbutton his shirt. I watched, my breath hitched in my chest, as he shrugged it off, revealing the broad, defined planes of his back. He kicked off his shoes and unbuckled his jeans, stepping out of them and leaving them in a neat pile on a deck chair. He stood for a moment in just his boxer briefs, a silhouette against the shimmering water. He was beautifully made, solid and real. He dove into the water without a sound, a clean, graceful arc that barely disturbed the surface. He surfaced in the middle of the pool, slicking his hair back with one hand. He looked at me, treading water, waiting. My turn. My hands are shaking as I undress. I feel clumsy and pale next to his easy confidence. I fold my clothes, my shirt, my jeans, and place them carefully on the chair next to his. The air is cool on my skin. I walk to the edge of the pool, my body thrumming with a mixture of terror and anticipation. I dive in. The water is a shock, cold and silky, and it steals my breath. I come up sputtering, gasping, the cold a welcome jolt to my overloaded senses. Mason is only a few feet away, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Better than the barbecue?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the water. "Much better," I managed to say. We swam for a while, not talking, just moving through the cool darkness. We kept a careful distance at first, circling each other like wary sharks. But the space between us seemed to shrink with each passing moment, the pull of gravity between two celestial bodies. Eventually, we found ourselves floating in the deep end, the water gently lapping around our shoulders. He reached out, and his fingers brushed my arm. It wasn't an accident. It was a question. I didn't pull away. He moved closer, his hand coming to rest on my waist. His touch was firm, possessive. He pulled me toward him until our bodies were almost touching, the cool water rushing between us. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I put my hands on his shoulders to steady myself. His skin was smooth, his muscles hard beneath my palms. "Leo," he whispered, his voice rough. He leaned in, and I met him halfway. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, a gentle exploration. Then the pressure deepened, and the kiss became something else. It was hungry, desperate, a release of all the tension that had been building between us for months. It was the taste of beer and chlorine and something that was just him. It was the feeling of his hand tightening on my waist, pulling me flush against him, the rough scrape of his stubble against my skin. It was everything I had been secretly, desperately, wanting. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We just floated there, foreheads pressed together, the water holding us up. I could feel the frantic beat of his heart against my chest, or maybe it was my own. I couldn't tell where I ended, and he began. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time had ceased to have any meaning. Eventually, the cold started to seep in, and we climbed out of the pool, shivering. We dried ourselves with the 2 towels he had brought out, a shared, silent intimacy in the simple act. I felt dazed, my mind still reeling from the kiss, from the feel of his body against mine. I started to gather my clothes, my movements clumsy and uncertain. What now? What did we do now? "Leave them," he said, his voice quiet. "You can get them in the morning." I looked at him, confused. "Go home, Leo," he said softly. "Go get some sleep." It felt like a dismissal, and a knot of panic tightened in my stomach. I had misread everything. It was a mistake. I nodded mutely, my throat too tight to speak. I walked back to my house in my damp boxer briefs, the wet fabric clinging uncomfortably to my skin. I felt exposed, raw, and utterly confused. I let myself into my dark, empty house and collapsed into bed, my head spinning. I didn't sleep. I just replayed the kiss, the touch, his words, over and over again, trying to make sense of it all. I had crossed the bridge, and now I was stranded on the other side, with no idea what came next. The sun was just beginning to bleach the darkness from the sky when I heard the knock. It was a soft, hesitant sound, completely different from the confident rap I'd heard during the power outage. My heart, which had been thudding a slow, anxious rhythm all night, leaped into my throat. I am a mess. My hair is wild from a sleepless night of tossing and turning. My eyes are gritty, and I'm still wearing the same damp boxer briefs from the pool. I don't care. I pull on a pair of sweatpants and stumble to the door, my entire body buzzing with a nervous energy that feels like it could power the whole neighborhood. I open the door. He is standing on my porch. The early morning light is soft, painting everything in pale shades of gray and rose. He looks tired, but his gaze is clear and direct. In his hands, he's holding my clothes from the night before, neatly folded. My jeans and my shirt. He holds them out to me. I take them automatically, my fingers brushing his. The brief contact is a spark that ignites the memory of the night before, the feel of his hands on my skin, his lips on mine. We just stand there for a moment, in the quiet of the dawn, the space between us humming with unspoken words. The air smells of dew and damp earth. A bird starts to sing in the old maple tree. He clears his throat, and his eyes drop to the clothes in my hands, then travel slowly up my body, lingering on my bare chest before meeting my gaze again. A small, almost imperceptible smile plays on his lips. "I think," he says, his voice a low, intimate rumble that sends a shiver down my spine. "I prefer you without them." And then he steps forward, closing the small distance between us. He cups my face in his hands, his palms rough and warm against my skin. He doesn't kiss me right away. He just looks at me, his dark eyes searching my face as if he's trying to memorize it. I can see the flicker of uncertainty in them, the same vulnerability I feel. He's taking a risk, too. My heart is hammering so hard I can feel it in my ears. This is it, the moment of truth. He leans in and kisses me. It's nothing like the hungry, desperate kiss in the pool. This is slow, deliberate, and breathtakingly tender. It's a kiss of confirmation, a statement. It's a promise. There's no frantic energy, no desperation. It is just right. Honest. Not rushed. It's the feeling of coming home after a long and difficult journey. He pulls back just enough to rest his forehead against mine. His eyes are closed. I can feel his breath, warm and steady, on my lips. My hands come up to rest on his wrists, my fingers wrapping around the solid bone and sinew. "I meant it, Leo," he whispers, his voice thick with emotion. "Last night. I meant it." Relief washes over me, so potent and overwhelming it makes my knees weak. He isn't regretting it. This is real. All the anxiety, the overthinking, the fear that had been my constant companions for months, it all just dissolves. It evaporates in the warmth of his touch, the honesty in his voice. "Me too." I breathe, the words catching in my throat. He opens his eyes, and the smile that spreads across his face is like the sunrise itself, chasing away the last of the shadows. He kisses me again, a quick, happy press of his lips to mine, and then he steps back, his hands dropping from my face. "I have to get to the workshop," he says, a hint of his usual practicality returning to his voice. "But maybe coffee later? On my porch." "Yeah," I say, a grin stretching my own lips. "I'd like that." He gives me one last look, a look so full of warmth and promise that it makes my chest ache in the best possible way. Then he turns and walks back across the lawn to his own house, his steps light and sure. I stand in my doorway, my folded clothes clutched to my chest, and watch him go. The sun is cresting the horizon now, flooding the world with golden light. The day is new, and for the first time in a very, very long time, so am I. The rest of that day passed in a surreal, dreamlike haze. I floated through my work, my fingers typing out emails and reports on autopilot while my mind was entirely elsewhere. It was replaying the dawn on my doorstep, the feel of his hands on my face, the quiet certainty in his voice. The world looked different, sharper, more vibrant. The beige walls of my house seemed less oppressive. The silence was no longer a sign of emptiness, but a peaceful quiet, a space for contemplation. I was terrified. A part of me, the old, cautious part that had run my life for so long, was screaming warnings. This was too fast, too good, too much. I was setting myself up for a fall. What did I really know about him? What if this was just a fleeting impulse for him? The anxiety was a familiar hum beneath the surface of my newfound euphoria. But every time the fear threatened to take hold, the memory of his kiss would rise up to meet it. The second kiss, the one that had been gentle and sure. It was an anchor in the storm of my own insecurity. As the afternoon wore on, the anxiety began to win. He hadn't texted. He hadn't called. The workshop was quiet. What if he'd had the day to think and was now regretting his morning's impulsiveness? My brain, a master craftsman of worst-case scenarios, began to build elaborate structures of rejection and humiliation. He was just being polite. He felt sorry for the lonely guy next door. It was a momentary lapse in judgment. By 5 o'clock, I had convinced myself it was over before it had even begun. I was pacing my kitchen, my stomach in knots, when I saw movement through the window. It was Mason, walking across his lawn toward my house. My heart did a painful flip-flop. This was it. He was coming to let me down gently. I braced myself, schooling my features into what I hoped was a mask of casual indifference. I opened the door before he could knock. He was holding a six-pack of beer, the same kind we'd had during the power outage. He looked tired from a day of work, a smudge of sawdust on his cheek, but his eyes were clear and steady as they met mine. "Porch is ready when you are," he said, his voice calm and even. No hesitation, no regret, just a simple statement. The relief was so sudden and absolute that I felt lightheaded. All the frantic energy drained out of me, replaced by a profound sense of calm. "Give me 2 minutes," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. We sat on his porch as the evening settled in, the chairs angled toward each other. The air cooled, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted over from a nearby bush. We drank our beers and we talked. Not about the kiss, not about what happened in the pool. We talked about our days. He told me about the custom bookshelf he was building for a client, the challenges of working with a piece of reclaimed walnut. I told him about the frustrating project I was managing, the endless conference calls and conflicting demands. It was normal. It was easy. The subtext was still there, a warm, steady current beneath the surface of the conversation, but the desperate, aching tension was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something solid and real. Reassurance. As the light faded, a comfortable silence fell between us. I watched his hands as he turned his beer bottle, his long fingers tracing the condensation. These were the hands that had held my face that morning, the hands that had steadied me, the hands I had watched for weeks from my window. "I woke up this morning," I said, the words coming out quietly, and I was terrified he stopped turning the bottle. He looked at me, his expression serious. He didn't say anything. He just waited, giving me the space to continue. "I thought I had imagined it," I confessed, the admission costing me. "Or that you'd regret it." He put his beer down on the table with a soft click. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees, and looked me straight in the eye. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Leo," he said, his voice low and firm. "Look at me, I did. I don't do things I regret. Not things like that." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I've been wanting to kiss you since the day I helped you with that tree." My world tilted on its axis. Since the tree. All those weeks. All that time I had spent watching him, yearning for him. He had been what? Watching me back? Wanting me to? The idea was too vast to fully comprehend. The entire narrative I had constructed in my head, of my unrequited, secret obsession, was wrong. It wasn't unrequited at all. It was mutual. "You hide it well," I said, a shaky laugh escaping me. "So do you," he countered, the corner of his mouth tilting up in that familiar half-smile. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to push. "I figured you'd let me know if you were interested." He let out a short, self-deprecating huff of air. "Turns out I'm not as patient as I thought." We sat with that for a moment, the shared confession hanging in the twilight air. All my fear, my internal doubt, seemed so foolish now. The biggest test hadn't been an external force. It had been my own inability to believe that someone like him could want someone like me. It was the ingrained habit of loneliness, the assumption of my own invisibility. He reached across the small space between our chairs and took my hand. He didn't just brush it. He laced his fingers through mine, his calloused palm warm and dry against my own. It was a deliberate, unambiguous gesture, an act of claiming, an answer to a question I hadn't even dared to ask. We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing left to say. We just sat there, hand in hand, watching the fireflies begin to flicker in the growing darkness, the silence between us more intimate than any words could ever be. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, but the house didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I made coffee, and instead of sitting at my kitchen table, I took the mug out to my own front porch. A few moments later, the door next door opened, and Mason came out, a mug in his own hand. He saw me and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that lit up his whole face. He walked over and sat on the steps next to me, our shoulders brushing. "Morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied. We sat in comfortable silence, sipping our coffee as the sun climbed higher, warming our faces. The world went on around us. A car drove by, someone's dog barked in the distance, the cicadas began their daily hum. It was all so wonderfully, beautifully ordinary. But for me, it was extraordinary. This simple, quiet intimacy was everything I had ever wanted without knowing how to ask for it. It was the end of a long, lonely chapter and the beginning of a new one. I looked at him, at his strong profile silhouetted against the morning light, and I felt a sense of profound rightness, a feeling of pieces clicking into place. He turned his head and caught me looking. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He just smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and leaned over to press a light kiss to my temple. My internal monologue, the constant, anxious chatter that had been the soundtrack to my life for as long as I could remember, was finally quiet. The loneliness that had been a physical ache in my chest had receded, replaced by a warm, steady glow. I was no longer an observer of my own life, watching from a safe distance behind a pane of glass. I was in it. I was a participant, and I was not alone. I leaned my head against his shoulder, closing my eyes and breathing in the scent of coffee and sawdust in him. I had moved to the suburbs seeking peace, a quiet place to hide from the world. I hadn't found it in the beige walls or the manicured lawns. I had found it here, on a porch step, at dawn, next to a man who saw me, truly saw me, and chose to stay. I felt like I had finally, after all this time, come home.